Anyway, let's just dive in. I have just a few slides to show you, and then Arnie's going to give you much more accurate information than me about this photographer. But John Zimmerman was born in 1927 and went off to another darkroom in 2002, but he played many rounds of golf with wonderful people before he went away. And for 4 decades, he was a world-class photographer for all of the top magazines during what was called the golden age of photojournalism. Magazines certainly like Life, Time, Ebony, Sports Illustrated. Over the course of his career, John Zimmerman photographed 10 different Olympic Games, created over 200 magazine covers, including maybe a dozen Sports Illustrated swimsuit issues. Hired in 1956 as one of the first staff photographers for Sports Illustrated, Zimmerman was instrumental in making the magazine a vanguard of innovative sports photography. He actually invented innovative techniques that hadn't existed before him, things like electronic lighting techniques, motor-driven camera sequences. You're going to see one of his time-lapse panning images up there of a church being moved, an entire building being moved down a street, and John he panned with the church so it's in focus and the rest of the city is blurred. Really innovative ideas. His work has been exhibited at numerous museums, including the International Center for Photography in New York, the News Museum in Washington, D.C., the Art Institute of Chicago, Brooklyn Museum. Among many of his published works are the early masters of contemporary photography, photographing sports, along with Neil Leifer and other world-class life photographers, and his recent monograph, America in Black and White, Selected Photographs of John G. Zimmerman. And he was also included in The Great Life Photographers, published in 2004. So let me dive in, and what I'd love to do for my part, for just my few minutes, and Arnie and I are interested in John Zimmerman for different reasons. It'll be fun to hear both of our approaches celebrating his work. But in my curator's statement upstairs, I said, rarely, very rarely, will a family walk into an art gallery and show the director a portfolio of their father's work and end up attending his gala exhibition opening months later, like this evening. But this was no ordinary father. Beautiful prints arrived in our gallery, and I worked very closely with Greg, Daryl, and Linda, who brought in test prints after they'd been printed at Rick's Coastal Giclée. We looked at them in the correct gallery lights, and the three of them and I, we put our foreheads together and we began working on the show almost as religiously. When you go upstairs and you sense a really positive vibe in this exhibition, it's because while we were hanging the show last week, these 4 Tibetan monks were creating this incredible mandala sand painting in the lobby of Sunset Center's theater. And it was open to the public, but really nobody really knew about it, so we'd work on hanging John's show for a while, and then we'd go and just crowd up to the Tibetan monks and give feedback, you know, grains of sand. But I'm here to tell you what really interested me when the family showed me John's work. And of course, all of us, whether we knew it or not, we've been seeing John's work anytime we opened up Life magazine. You'll see what I regard as the greatest golf photograph ever taken upstairs, and you've all seen it a million times. It's on book covers. The one of Arnold Palmer sinking a putt, kind of rocking back in celebration. That was John Zimmerman, with hundreds of other classics that he shot from the 50s up through the 70s. Anyway, I saw this John Zimmerman, which just blows my mind. You could just imagine how surreal this is to have. This is a waiting room, and these people are probably just in sensory overload, sitting in front of this, you know, maniacal wallpaper background. Now, I taught the history of photography, and I'm going to give you a very, very tough question, a very tough challenge. I don't expect anybody to answer this because it's kind of an obscure quiz question, but I am offering $10 million. If somebody, you know, looked at this and loved this image, whose eye had seen a few other photos in his or her day, can anybody think of what this image, with just frenetic wallpaper, with people sitting in front of it, can you think of another image that this brings up? Who's that?
I thought it looks like DNA sequences.
Oh, yes! You know, can you shout that out? You said this looks like DNA sequences. I'm giving you the $10 million because this is what I saw. This is what I thought of. This is Diane Arbus, and here are triplets. You are a genius, my friend. You mean you saw Zimmerman's, you know, almost genetic sequencing. This is, you know, a world-class photograph by Diane Arbus. And these are triplets in their bedrooms, and I just marvel every time I look at this. Not only is that an amazing picture of triplets at home, Diane Arbus talked her way into their bedroom, but like the parents had triplets, and then I'm sure subconsciously chose DNA sequencing wallpaper. I mean, if that doesn't look like little genome things, I don't know what does. It's just unbelievable. Thank you for picking up on that. So, I'm just going to put my notes down. And so these are the kinds of things that I started seeing in Zimmerman's work. And he's working at exactly the same time that Diane Arbus is working. That might have been a coincidence that Zimmerman had something in common. Maybe that was just random luck that he was sort of keying in on something that an American giant in photography was working on. Diane was working in the 50s and the 60s. This is exactly when Zimmerman's working. But then I started seeing other relationships he had with these world-class people in the art world and the documentary world. Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange. This is called this is called Ex-Slave with a Long Memory. Dorothea Lange. And that's a John Zimmerman portrait of a sharecropper that you'll see upstairs. And many of Zimmerman's work have incredible backstories. Are you going to tell us about this? Beautiful, beautiful. You're going to get this story with a much more lovely Belgian accent than mine. And just when John Zimmerman was photographing African-American funerals for Ebony magazine in the 1950s, another dude was photographing African-American funerals at exactly that same time period, named Robert Frank. That's Robert Frank on the left and John Zimmerman's image on the right. So these are the things that I started seeing going through his book. A spectacular image by John Zimmerman. You know, this might have been an assignment, a magazine assignment, but what I picked up on is how John Zimmerman, not that he was a freedom fighter, you know, or an evangelist, but I see it again and again, his eye picked up on inequities. He photographed realities of the 1950s. You know, today we're sort of, today we're picking up on the racial inequity implied in this image. But this was just reality, as you all know. And that made me think of another Robert Frank image, another incredible image. Oh, hey, Jack, maybe let's, you know what? I'm going to look a lot better all of a sudden. Good. And so do the pictures. But here's a Robert Frank picking up on relationships, racial relationships, at exactly the same time that Zimmerman is showing us these relationships. As I end my curator's statement upstairs, you'll see a statement by both Arnie, and Arnie wrote a beautiful essay for the Zimmerman monograph, and Arnie also wrote the statement for our own catalog. Thanks a million. But the both of us have brief statements on the gallery wall. And you'll see that I end my statement by saying when we look back on Zimmerman's photographs that simply capture reality years ago, and we compare it to now, let us hope things have changed for the better. So I'd love to introduce Arnie de Vinda, who is a lecturer and researcher at PXLMAD. Do you?
Mad.
Pixelmad. Pixelmad, beautiful. School of Arts, Lucca School of Arts, or LUCA School of Arts, and the University of Leuven, all in Belgium. His work is incredibly diverse. It was such a treat to meet him as a young, hip man, because I thought I was corresponding with a much older person with all the accomplishments that you have. But his work encompasses very diverse subjects ranging from contemporary literature like Reinhard Jürgel, Thomas Meinecke, Kenneth Goldsmith, Zilke Zimmerman. I know I butchered those names. And this is just a glimpse of the inside of his mind. And the reception of conservative discourses, for example, Oswald Spengler in contemporary culture via 20th century photography, and word and image interaction, and the imagination of sports, and also the clandestine history of the Mattentaart, which is a regional Belgian cake. Jocelyn, you know a Mattentaart, huh?
It's a cookie.
Yes, cookie. I'm glad that's not slang for...
Okay, sorry, pastry.
And in 2016, he co-edited this beautiful monograph, America in Black and White, Selected Photographs of John G. Zimmerman. He's a member of the editorial board of cultural magazine Recto Verso, and co-founder and editor of Collateral, the online journal for cross-cultural close reading. Please welcome Arnie de Vinde.
Hi, hello. But Brian is exaggerating. But he's not exaggerating about my Belgian accent, as you can experience right away. No, many thanks for the invitation, many thanks for the introduction. So here we are at the Venerable Center for Photographic Art, and to be honest, I don't think that John G. Zimmerman considered himself an artist. Probably he never meant his pictures to be put on display in a White Cube gallery or museum. Probably he would have said, guys, what's the fuss? I was just doing my job. And at the same time, doing his job was a flagrant understatement of what Zimmerman was actually doing. Like a maniac, he was hopping from assignment to assignment, being away from home 300 out of 365 days, driven by an exuberant desire to experience and to see. In this sense, the John G. Zimmerman archive, in which this vertiginous collection of thousands and thousands of images are amassed, this archive is a kind of atlas of the 20th century, registering both its major and minor events and persons, documenting its worldviews and lifestyles, and not in the least, its tensions and ruptures. Zimmerman's massive oeuvre is more than an accumulation of assignments and experiments. It shows a distinctive artistic signature, an unmistakable look and take on the world. It's high time to spell out this signature and present Zimmerman as the artist he was. Probably against his will, as I said, probably against his will, but he's not the first and will not be the last genius misrecognizing and downplaying his or her magnificent work. In order to do so, to spell out the signature, one has to detach his fabulous pictures from their magazine context, without, of course, neglecting this narrative and historical context. After all, Zimmerman is a storyteller or a chronicler. But if you free Zimmerman's pictures from the cramped magazine layout, with its shrill ads, cartoons, and headings, their internal dynamism suddenly grabs your full attention. And the show demonstrates this. And that's what happened actually also 3 years ago, when I and my colleague, Lieven van Spijbelen, Belgian colleague, were working on a book publication on nicknames in sports and titled, what was the title again?
The Eagle?
The Eagle, yeah, but the Dutch title was a book publication in Dutch. The Adelaar van Benidorm, the Eagle of Benidorm. Did you know this famous Spanish city? No, Benidorm. No. All Belgians go to Benidorm when you go to Spain. It's wrong. No, it's kind of gated Antwerp community. But, okay, but good. We were preparing this book publication on nicknames in sports, and we hit upon this epic picture by John G. Zimmerman. A picture of Frank Gifford, being knocked down by Chuck Bednarik of the Philadelphia Eagles. And it really is a bustling image based on a captivating interplay between movement and stillness, between horizontality and verticality, between black and white, all enforced by the most peculiar perspective. We seem to observe this battlefield scene entrenched between clods of earth and grass. And everyone seems to turn their head away from this dramatic incident and its protagonist, except for the photographer, and thus us as a viewer. And we definitely wanted to include this picture in our book. And so we contacted the archive, and the archive granted us the permission on a couple of conditions. And I admitted to Linda, the director of the archive, we surely wouldn't be able to meet all these expectations, but we expressed our willingness, our genuine willingness, to think about future Zimmerman projects. And Linda, John's daughter and director of the archive, surely didn't believe a word of it, but the rest is history. So together we published American Black and White, organized a concomitant show in Belgium in 2016, in which also 5 contemporary Belgian artists participated and thought about the legacy of John G. Zimmerman. And last month we finished a second book manuscript entitled Crossing the Line, Arthur Ashe at the 1968 US Open. And I will talk about it later on. But good. Back to Bednarik. As this image is exemplary of John G. Zimmerman's aesthetics, I'd like to give you some directives, but not in the authoritarian sense of the word, but rather in the German sense of the word Richtlinie, which literally means lines of sight, some directives or lines of sight. And when you walk through the magnificent show curated by Brian, I suggest to explore what I'd like to call the 3 gravitational axes of Zimmerman's art. So 3 gravitational centers or axes. And the first axis is composition, and more specifically, the tension between capturing and staging. Many of Zimmerman's I forgot a slide. This is the book cover of American Black and White. Okay. Good. The tension between capturing and staging. Many of Zimmerman's pictures are tableaux vivants that seem at once very authentic and staged. Think of this very first picture he made, a portrait of his family from 1941, or this picture, washing dishes, which both seem to give exclusive access to a private, intimate scene, which has in fact already been disrupted by the presence of the photographer and his equipment, where we're not thinking about the presence of the photographer. He's giving us a seemingly exclusive access to an intimate scene. Waiting Room 2 shows Zimmerman's refined sense for theatricality, but at first sight seems an incidental snapshot of a group of people waiting is actually a very sophisticated composition based on preparation, and yet again preparation. Or as a photographer himself put it in 1960, I quote, "In a way, that's all good pictures are. Planned pictures, good ideas, perfectly executed." End of quote. So, what seem snapshots of fleeting instants are the outcome of intricate framing and endless series of tests. It is well known that Zimmerman was a mad scientist. We like to call him the mad scientist, who was constantly manipulating and converting his equipment, constantly testing out mechanics and machinery. And this urge, this technological urge, derives from a second gravitational axis, the tension between movement on one hand and stillness on the other hand. So the tension between movement and stillness. On the one hand, what drives Zimmerman is his desire to make the dynamite photograph, and to go looking for the ultimate moment when things are about to happen. And just look at this stupendous picture of Wilt Chamberlain in the process of dunking. Or this photograph of the arrival of the Finn Antiviscari in the Boston Marathon. It shows an inextricable tangle of divergent, contrasting movements and forces. Really very complex image. So Zimmerman's pictures are full of dynamism, full of vibrancy. It's like chaos frozen forever, arrested development. So that was what the, let's say, the movement part of the gravitational axis is concerned. Then the second pole of the second, at the other end of the spectrum, you have this stillness. Yeah? So on the other hand, Zimmerman also looked beyond the momentum. Often his pictures are still lifes, exuding a peculiar kind of quiescence. Yeah? Swimming Pool, for example, is almost an impressionistic tableau à la Monet, Claude Monet. And his numerous depictions of sportsmen and women are not only baffling action shots, but above all, subtle character studies. And I will talk about his Ash series later on. It's a great example. On the one hand, you have tremendous pictures of Ash in action, and on the other hand, very subtle, very complex portraits, character studies. Okay. What makes, thirdly, Zimmerman's pictures so intriguing is that what I like to call the vibrancy, or perplexing perpetual dynamism. And according to me, this enticing interaction with the viewer is based on Zimmerman's crafty play with the gaze. So my third directive is to look at the multi-directional gazes Zimmerman stages. So constantly you hit upon wandering eyes. And those wandering eyes he depicts, let our eyes as a viewer too wander around. Yeah? So his images constantly capture a complex interplay of looks in every direction. From scattered eyes and evasive eyes over surprised and curious to sharp, piercing gazes. So some characters look into a mirror, others are blindfolded, some look away almost in an embarrassed way, others stare at the photographer, just like here. They stare at the photographer and thus at us, as if to disarm us. Yeah? Whether one likes it or not, these images appeal to us, telling us to mind our own fucking business or seeking empathy. Yeah? So the girl, for example, this is my favorite image. I talked to the docents an hour ago, and this is really my favorite Zimmerman image because it's so complex what the gazes are concerned. The girl in the iron lung getting a polio treatment is not only being looked at as some sort of passive and immobile object of study, and looked at by doctors, nurses, photographers, and thus us, she also looks back. And that makes this image so interesting. She looks back, yeah? Not finding consolation from a doll, a mirror, or penguin. You see the penguin on top. It was actually a toddler who noticed this penguin the very first time. I hadn't seen it. So during a guided tour for toddlers in a small provincial town in Belgium, suddenly a toddler said, penguin. And that's the first time I saw the penguin. It's so fantastic. The girl not finding consolation in these elements and looking back, staring back at the photographer and thus looking back at us. Yeah? As an unfathomable other, she addresses us. And that's what's so interesting about this gaze. But I'm talking too much with my Belgian accent. But Zimmerman is interested not only in the way his characters look, but also in what they are looking at. Zimmerman is fascinated with groups and crowds looking as if paralyzed at one and the same object, such as a belly dancer or a rat catcher. The fantastic image of the rat catcher is in the show here. You should look at it. It's not in my presentation. But here we hit, according to me, upon the crux of Zimmerman's exploration of the gaze. Namely the question, what is able to attract and distract us? What captivates us and draws our attention? In this sense, Zimmerman's oeuvre is also a kind of genealogy, an archaeology of 20th century pop culture based on the enigmatic, even magnetic force which persons and objects can and do exercise. What makes Zimmerman's work so intriguing, according to me, is the ambivalent double role his work played. He was, after all, a magazine photographer, he was an advertising man, he was one of the madmen of the 1960s. So, as a magazine photographer and an ad man, Zimmerman, of course, himself cultivated the charisma and the enigma of the things he reproduced. But at the same time, he also revealed how this mesmerizing effect comes about. And in this sense, the series he made on the Beatles is very exemplary. He photographs the Beatles, but at the same time shows how they are being photographed, are being captured, how they are captured and constructed by cameras. So in a way, it's a kind of critique on the advertising and popular culture he was participating in himself. Now, more generally, one might argue that Zimmerman's work dissects the politics of the gaze. In numerous pictures, for example, he demonstrates how Nixon and Eisenhower, and many other presidents for that sake, could grab audiences like no one else. He analyzes how people get a kind of charisma and are able to captivate the attention of audiences. But it's not only about politics in the narrow sense, but rather about the power relations that exchanging gazes entails. This Weather Girls, for example, exposes the male gaze and its power regime. All the more if you notice the male photographer lying under the table on which the Weather Girls are seated. So it's a very complicated image. It's a critique on gender relations and how exchanging gazes always entails a kind of power relation with the patriarch in the middle. Okay. But what makes Zimmerman's work so topical is its insight that the politics of the gaze is always bound up with the politics of race. Zimmerman understood, like no one else, that racial relations are performed through practices of looking. A shocking case in point is the story of Matt Ingram, a black sharecropper who was charged with so-called reckless eyeballing in 1951. If a black man at that time even dared to look at a white woman, or if that woman imagined that she was being looked at, the man could be accused of sexual harassment and even rape. And it happened to Matt Ingram, who had apparently frightened his 17-year-old female neighbor by looking at her from some 20 yards away. Now, not only Zimmerman's early assignments in the 1950s on the Jim Crow South for the African-American magazine Ebony, however, show a profound sensitivity for the African-American cause. Throughout his career, the African-American experience and struggle was a major concern and interest of Zimmerman. It's no coincidence that he made numerous, really umpteen series on black athletes from the most diverse sports disciplines, including Althea Gibson, Wilt Chamberlain, Sugar Ray Robinson, Wilma Rudolph, and Arthur Ashe. Now, our latest book, Crossing the Line, focuses precisely on this remarkable encounter between John G. Zimmerman and Arthur Ashe at the 1968 US Open. 50 years ago, exactly 50 years ago, Arthur Ashe, who grew up in the segregated South, was the first black man to win a Grand Slam tennis tournament. And his victory, his US Open victory in 1968, was a truly iconic moment, not only in sports history, but in American history in general. On September 9 and 10, 1968, Zimmerman had the exclusive opportunity to follow Ashe both on court and off court. And as a live photographer, he was able to document the most consequential 36 hours of Ashe's career, which would also drastically change the face of international tennis. Zimmerman had what makes the series so incredibly special is that Zimmerman had an unrivaled access to Ashe that is unimaginable today in the star cultus and the star culture we're experiencing now. And this experience resulted in hundreds of never before seen, never before published pictures which capture how Ashe both on and off court operated. And this is a really mind-blowing series. And what emanates from these images, I will show a couple of them. These are action shots. This is let's say, a typical Zimmerman shot. Capturing crowds watching a ball. Analyzing the magnetic effect a seemingly banal ball can exercise. During the trophy ceremony. But it's very interesting, this gravitational axis between, let's say, movement and stillness. On the one hand, you have this very impressive action shots, and on the other hand, subtle character studies. Subtle portraits, very complex, intimate portraits. And what emanates from these images is a kind of bond of intimacy and trust. And precisely because of his discreetness, Zimmerman was able to get behind the adopted shield of a man known to be aloof, always on guard, a man to be known to have always his sensors out. And what Zimmerman's series displays is how Ash acted and interacted in an almost exclusively white environment. And in the most diverse settings, off-court settings, casinos, hotel lobbies, subway stations, etc., etc. So Zimmerman's pictures, Ash pictures, are subtle milieu sketches portraying a man managing to shift back and forth between different worlds. What Zimmerman's pictures, but also the book in its entirety, depict is the complex man behind the icon. So we have, it's very interesting to see how Ash has been reduced to a kind of icon, a kind of sanitized icon. But it's very interesting if you look at those 1,200 pictures, you see a very complex image of a complex man, not the sanitized icon he has been reduced to. So, good. So what the book tries to do is to depict or to show actually this complex man behind the icon. And apart from Zimmerman's portraits, the publication includes essays, numerous essays, by and interviews with prominent voices from the most diverse public domains. For example, tennis legend John McEnroe, Olympic swimming champion Simone Manuel, photography critic Maurice Berger, sports photographer Walter Hughes, to name but a few. Very interesting perspective, a mosaic kind of perspective on Ash. And with this book, we want to, let's say, think through not only Arthur Ashe's legacy, but also John G. Zimmerman's far-reaching legacy. And this exhibit 2, this show 2, is an important contribution to this joint ambition. Now, Crossing the Line, this book I've been talking about, is the result of 1 year of painstakingly hard work and intense collaboration with the Zimmerman family, the John G. Zimmerman archive. And that's why I'd like to offer the very first material copy. In Dutch we say fresh from the presses, but it does not exist. Is there a similar kind of expression? Yes. Fresh, but fresh from the presses sounds better. So, anyhow, I'm ruining a kind of ceremonial moment. That's why I'd like to offer the very first copy of this new book to my sister in arms, and probably the most passionate person I know, the director of the archive, and John's daughter, Linda Zimmerman. Really unpacking. And actually I'm finished, so many thanks for working.
Yes, we certainly have time for questions, and you're even more of an authority than I am, although I'm hesitant to bring Arnie back because that was such a fantastic lecture. All I can say is, dude, that's the last time I'm going to let you lecture after me. That was excellent. But yeah, let's.
But if there are any questions, in a jet lag mood.
Oh, kind of, wow! I thought you were kind of
hyperkinetic. Yeah, exactly.
But we've got Mrs. Zimmerman and 3 super talented kids that can answer any questions if anything's on your mind about his career in sports or yeah.
I'd like to ask, in what ways, if you could summarize, in what ways do you see John Zimmerman as a pioneer of photography?
Well, the thing is, what we've not been talking about, or Brian has mentioned it, he has introduced a lot of technological introductions. And for example, in the exhibition we set up in Belgium, we tried to focus on that aspect. And he was really, as we called him, a mad scientist, a maniac who introduced lots of technological innovations. For example, he was the first to put a camera on a, how do you call it, a basketball ring? No, basketball hoop. Basketball hoop. On a basketball hoop in an ice hockey net, for example. But that's interesting, but often he has been reduced to the technological innovator he was. What we're trying to do is look at the work as autonomous art objects. I mean, as autonomous artistic images. Images which are very complex, very refined. And what makes his work so innovating, I would say, you can't imagine how many images the John Z. Zimmerman archive stores. And if you look at all those images, you get really a kind of alternative history of America, or even of the world, of the 20th century. And that makes it really interesting. I mean, the archive has amassed, I think, 10,000 of images. And it's incredible, because you really have a kind of overview of 20th century America. And that makes it really interesting.
Can I just add one thing to that? Arnie approached us and decided to focus on the black and white photography, because in this moment, a lot of the technical innovations my dad did, because we live in an age of Photoshop, they seem very kind of banal and commonplace. He tried to do a lot of things in camera. And so we're actually trying to find a context in which to introduce an exhibition about that would segue into where we are now as kind of a transition. But it's hard to get people interested, because we've advanced so far beyond with the technology to where he was.
It's very interesting to see, for example, how he tested all of his new techniques on his family. His family was actually a study object. So we found all those pictures of you riding on bikes just to test new techniques. That was really, or he invented a kind of kaleidoscopic technique for a new advertising campaign and tested this technique on his children, which was so interesting to see. Yeah.
I know a lot of photographers are very careful about their prints and the negatives, and they want to create their own prints. And I'm just curious if he, in his work, sometimes they destroy the negatives so that no one else can make the print. And I'm just curious about how he did that part of his work.
Well, I think maybe Linda, you can answer that question, how he dealt with his negatives and his rolls and his...
Well, he wasn't in the darkroom like Ansel Adams.
Okay,
Although when he was younger, when he made his first photograph of his family when he was 14, he was in the darkroom mastering, developing, and he thought that kind of helped inform his understanding of photography and exposure and everything. But then when he went from assignment to assignment, and he did over 1,600 assignments in his career, and we haven't even gone through, we've kind of skimmed the top of what we've seen. They would be developed in the magazine labs, and so he would not have developed them, and they would pick out what they thought was interesting. And so what's fascinating now is, for instance, the experience of Arnie doing the book. He went and picked images that we had never seen before, because after 50 years, what's interesting now that the context has changed and what was originally published in the magazine is totally different.
Is he primarily 35 millimeter, or did he use larger format?
All those technical questions I can't answer, really.
Daryl.
Daryl.
My father used all sorts of formats from 35 millimeter up till 8 by 10. It's just that for most of the magazine assignments, since you had so much equipment that you had to move quickly, that would be limited to 35 millimeter. And so it has a certain proportion. So the ones that you see in the show that are either extreme horizontals or verticals, those are normally 35 millimeter. And then the ones that you see that are square, those are usually larger formats, like 2 1/4.
It's interesting that, you as a doctor have, I think it's PhD in literature, and that you have decided to focus on, 2 books on photography, and has it changed the way you've looked at things or approached art?
Yeah, of course. I mean, actually, I have a PhD in German literary studies in German literature. So my background is actually literary studies. But 10 years ago, I started working at art campuses, at which I work with the most diverse people from the most diverse disciplines. And the thing is, the criticism I get a lot is that I'm way too impulsive. That if I see something interesting, that I jump on it and develop a project on it. And you could say it's a kind of similar story. I saw this one picture, was completely obsessed with this picture. I wanted this picture in this book, and that was the start of a story. But of course, I mean, it's like John G. Zimmerman hopping from impulse to impulse. But at the same time, and that's the really interesting thing, this is a long-term project we're working on, and I feel we have a kind of joint ambition to really think through what I said, to think through the John G. Zimmerman legacy, and so for me it's a long-term project, whereas other things are more hopping around like a maniac. But of course it's changed my entire way of looking at images. I mean, it's what I said. What interests me in these images, I can look again and again at those images and still discover new details. It was I was moved when I saw the images now at this show. It's really incredible because I rediscovered the images in a completely new way. Although we in a show in Belgium, we had also beautiful prints, but it's a completely new experience. I constantly discover new details. Also in this Ash series, 1,000 pictures, I've seen them 30, 40 times, but I can't keep looking at them. And that's what discerns these images from others. I mean, that makes them unique. If you keep going back to the same images again and again. For example, the image with the girl getting a polio treatment, I've rediscovered this image today because of another size, other details, another quality of printing. So that makes it so interesting and compelling.
Were the prints for the show made from the original negatives, or were they made from other prints?
Daryl?
I tend to get the technical questions.
Yeah.
So,
I
because
have
they
no
weren't,
technological expertise whatsoever.
they weren't taken as fine art prints from the beginning. They were in a commercial atmosphere. And so, and in a very pressured weekly deadline for the weekly magazines. So there would be a big rush to take the photos, get the film to the lab, get the photos chosen, and then put in the magazine. And for the Ash project, for instance, there were 43 rolls and only 4 or 5 pictures ended up in the magazine. So all those other pictures, hundreds of pictures, just went into storage for 45 years until we got them back from Life magazine.
So you are doing it from the film?
So we're not doing it from the film because they weren't treated in a pristine manner, and they're so damaged, there's so much dust, so many scratches, so many fingerprints, that we couldn't make pristine prints from the originals. So we scan them at a high resolution and then make digital prints.
So you scanned the prints?
We scanned the negatives, the
Oh,
original
okay.
negatives, and then work on the digital scan.
Wow.
And sometimes it takes 10 to 12 hours of retouching to get it in a presentable form.
Great. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about the process of acquiring all those negatives for the archive?
Linda, do you want to take that?
Maybe the Arnold Palmer image, huh?
Well, the Arnold Palmer image is actually owned by Sports Illustrated. Probably 90% of the photographs we own because my father looked out for the copyright, but early in his career he was on staff, and when he was on staff, that means that the magazines would own that. So the 5 years that he was on staff at Sports Illustrated, they owned those photos, and there are many iconic images in there. A few of them are in the show. But after my dad passed away in 2002, there was no archive, and we slowly came to the realization that we wanted to preserve his legacy. So we started tracing where his photographs were. They were spread out in magazine archives around the country. We did have some of them, but we We had to negotiate with other archives to get the photographs returned to us. So it took about 10 years to get all of the photographs back under one roof. And so that was quite an accomplishment. And we didn't have much to show for that. I mean, this is an exciting phase for us because his work is being put out into the world and reintroduced. But the work of organizing the archive continues.
Are you digitizing all of them?
Well, so we're following the rule for archives, which is you kind of, with massive historical archives, you kind of do the 20-80% rule. So we're taking the 20% off the top, that is kind of the cream, and we're focusing on digitizing those. And we have a slate of books that we would like to do in exhibitions, and then that'll probably be our lifetime. And hopefully by the time it gets into an archive, our goal is to have known the extent of what he did so that people can find it in wherever it lands. And we're also looking for a home for the archive.
I have a question. You answered something. I was curious about the copyright because it was done. But I was thinking about Gordon Parks. And he was working at the time in Life magazine and the black and white. And I was wondering if they had a relationship of some sort. I would imagine they would have and had influenced maybe each other. Do you know anything about that?
They were colleagues at Life.
Right.
And I know that my father had a great amount of respect, and we grew up knowing that Gordon Parks was the gold standard. Was it a specific question about copyright?
Well, it was the fact that when I meant black and white issues, I mean, we were talking about racial issues came up in this. And since Gordon Parks was so, special and unique and so influential, and their father had that opportunity, I was just wondering if they influenced each other, worked together.
Well, so black photographers couldn't go down to the South during those Jim Crow years. So Ebony was started by Johnson with the idea of emulating Life. And his dream was to have a stable of black photographers. But that was a long road for him to realize that. So he started out by hiring photographers like my father who would have worked for Life. Then they also worked for Ebony, and eventually they would hire black photographers to kind of learn on the job and get the training, and then when they came up to speed, black photographers, but Gordon Parks was a brilliant outlier. I mean, he was just in there from the early years. But it was a different experience. Like when he went down, I forget where he went. Life sent him to the South to do a photo essay on a black family, 3 generations of a black family. And really different dynamic, of course, black photographer with a black family than my dad.
Fantastic. This may be a solo exhibition of a talented photographer, but we have at least 4 experts that you can talk to with a glass of wine in your hand. How's that? Arnie and I have titillated you. We showed very few images. We didn't want to do any spoilers, but let's go upstairs and see some magnificently printed.
Is that good?